So let's start with a really a profound question. What happens when a foundational constitutional guardrail fails?
You mean something like the U.S. Senate?
Exactly. The
Yeah.
very institution designed by the founders to be the primary check against a dangerous or, well, an unfit president. What happens when it fails to hold?
That is the powerful question at the heart of the book we're diving into today, The Betrayal: How Mitch McConnell and the Senate Republicans Abandoned America.
It's by Ira Shapiro, who's a lawyer and a former Senate staffer. And you commissioned this deep dive because you want to know if Shapiro really proves that central, very provocative claim.
That claim of betrayal, and maybe more importantly, to what extent the Senate itself is permanently broken.
And for this, we're taking a new, in-depth approach. This is going to be an extended summary.
Right. So unlike our previous reviews, which are more of a focused analysis, this is a comprehensive overview. We're going to trace the intellectual roots, the key arguments, and the real-world impact of this subject.
And if you appreciate this expanded format, if you find it helpful, please let us know. Your feedback is really going to help shape future content.
The book's narrative, it covers the period starting with Donald Trump's entry into politics, goes through his 4 years in office, and then extends into the opening of Joe Biden's first year.
But Shapiro's focus is squarely on the Senate Republicans, isn't it?
Yes. On how they deployed, or in his view, disastrously failed to deploy, the institution's constitutional powers during a period of, well, what he calls extreme executive overreach.
And as we unpack all this, we want to let you know that you are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation. It's powered by Google's Notebook LM, and it's all designed for deeper, more dynamic book summaries.
Okay, so to understand the betrayal that Shapiro alleges, we can't actually start with Trump.
No, you have to start with Mitch McConnell.
Exactly. The book paints him as the true institutional architect. It spends a lot of time chronicling his calculated rise through the Senate leadership.
Describing him as a master of procedure, someone who just understood the rules better than anyone else.
And was willing to use them ruthlessly. Shapiro presents him less as a traditional legislator and more as someone just focused on acquiring power.
So what were the specific tools the book says he weaponized?
Well, the focus wasn't on passing big bipartisan legislation. It was really on two things: judicial appointments and systematically blocking Democratic initiatives.
Right. Shapiro
Yeah.
talks about how he mastered the filibuster during the Obama years, basically just grinding the Senate to a halt.
And that's what established his reputation, placing party and ideology above the spirit of legislative compromise.
Which brings us to a really pivotal moment. The book frames it as an institutional original sin that kind of foreshadowed everything that was to come.
You're talking about the Merrick Garland blockade in 2016.
Yes.
Absolutely. Shapiro treats McConnell's decision not to even consider President Obama's Supreme Court nominee as the key episode. It showed just how far he would go.
What was the justification at the time?
The argument was that in an election year, the people should choose the president, and that president should choose the nominee. For Shapiro, this was just a massive, unprecedented power grab to secure a conservative judiciary.
And this destroyed a norm, really. It set the central tension for the next administration. So how does the author distill this down into a core thesis?
The core thesis is this. Shapiro argues that during the Trump presidency, McConnell and the Senate Republicans routinely and willfully enabled the executive branch
Enabled it how?
by ignoring or actively suppressing the Senate's constitutional role as a check. They prioritized getting judicial power and short-term partisan wins over their institutional responsibility.
So Shapiro is saying the institutional decay was a conscious choice. But does the book acknowledge that this kind of thing, using the filibuster so aggressively, started long before Trump?
That's a fair point.
Yeah.
Shapiro does acknowledge that the Senate has always been polarized, but he contends that McConnell escalated it. He turned procedure from a defensive tactic into an offensive weapon.
He turned the entire focus of the chamber away from legislating.
Precisely.
So once Trump was in office, the book describes this: uneasy alliance. You have a chaotic White House paired with a very disciplined Senate leadership.
And McConnell immediately channeled all that administration energy into his long-term goals: tax reform, regulatory rollbacks, and of course, rapid judicial confirmation.
The first big legislative push the book details was the attempt to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, the ACA.
Right. And McConnell drove a series of votes using fast-track budget reconciliation procedures. That whole exercise revealed the immense pressure leadership could exert.
I remember that being incredibly dramatic.
Yeah.
How does the book use that fight to highlight its thesis about institutional decay?
The key is reconciliation. Shapiro points out that reconciliation is normally for purely fiscal matters, but it became McConnell's institutional sledgehammer.
It's a tool that lets the majority bypass the filibuster.
Exactly. Bypassing the very rules designed to protect the minority. It showed that if the goal was important enough, like gutting, the ACA, McConnell was willing to just ignore the spirit of cross-party cooperation entirely.
But the true definition of the Trump-McConnell partnership wasn't legislative, was it? It was the sheer speed of judicial confirmations.
This is where the book argues the norms weren't just bent, they were fundamentally broken. McConnell accelerated the pace by shortening debate time, but the most revealing change was weakening the blue slip tradition.
Okay, for those who aren't procedural experts, remind us what the blue slip is and why its erosion matters so much.
Of course. The blue slip was this long-standing tradition. It allowed home state senators, regardless of party, to essentially veto a federal judicial nominee in their state.
Just by withholding a piece of paper.
Right. And Shapiro argues that weakening this tradition was a clear sign that political expediency now trumped everything else. The Senate stopped being a check on the quality of nominees and just became a rubber stamp machine.
And that procedural warfare really peaked with the 3 Supreme Court nominations.
Yes. First, Neil Gorsuch. To get him confirmed after the Garland blockade, the Senate just eliminated the filibuster for Supreme Court nominees.
A huge change.
Shapiro stresses that this was the final institutional barrier falling. It basically ensured that all high-stakes appointments from then on would be purely partisan battles, decided by a simple majority.
Then came the confirmations of Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett.
The book really summarizes the tense hearings and the public protests during the Kavanaugh fight. But the most jarring contrast is Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation.
Because of the timing.
The sheer hypocrisy of it. Confirming her in the final weeks before an election. It was a complete reversal of the justification McConnell used for blocking Garland just 4 years earlier. For Shapiro, this is the most powerful evidence of institutional betrayal.
That chronological account brings us to the midpoint of the Trump term, right before the first major constitutional stress test.
And this type of in-depth analysis is just one part of a larger mission we have. We really encourage you to check out Mindful Moments. It's our YouTube channel offering AI, book analysis, summaries, and critiques.
It's all about inspiring reflection and rational thought, and it's also really valuable for aspiring authors.
So, shifting to constitutional checks, Shapiro argues the real moment of truth came with the Ukraine scandal,
which led to Trump's first impeachment for abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. The betrayal heavily reconstructs the Senate's role in that trial.
This is where the procedural arguments became absolutely crucial. Shapiro focuses on the debate over whether to allow witnesses and additional documents.
And the book details how McConnell, seeing the trial as purely political, just orchestrated the entire Republican response behind the scenes.
He secured a short, tightly controlled trial.
But why did he fight so hard to block witnesses, people like John Bolton, who had firsthand information? If the Senate is a check, wouldn't they want all the evidence?
Shapiro claims McConnell's rationale was to prevent the Senate from becoming an investigative body. But in doing so, he effectively undermined the constitutional purpose of the trial,
turning the Senate into a shield for the executive,
instead of a court of impartial judgment. The book notes a few Republicans briefly considered supporting witnesses, but ultimately, McConnell's discipline prevailed. It was all about political loyalty.
Then, moving into 2020, the focus shifts to the pandemic. This was a unique moment where necessity briefly forced some bipartisan cooperation.
It did. Shapiro describes the passage of several huge relief packages: direct aid, unemployment benefits, business support. The book highlights the high-stakes negotiations between McConnell, Mnuchin, Pelosi, and Schumer.
What were the key partisan sticking points that the book says shaped that legislation?
The author really emphasizes the intense framing of it all. McConnell drew a very firm line against what he consistently called blue state bailouts.
Federal aid to state and local governments.
Right. Aid that Democrats argued was essential for police, fire, and school systems. Shapiro shows how these political positions shaped the final bills, often delaying desperately needed aid.
As we approach the end of the term, we get to the final crisis, the 2020 election and January number 6.
And The book provides a meticulous account of how Senate Republicans responded to Trump's claims of fraud in the weeks leading up to the certification.
It chronicles the plan by certain Republican senators to formally object to state results during the joint session.
Giving the president's challenge a legislative platform, the narrative is visceral here, describing how that process was so violently interrupted by the attack on the Capitol.
What struck me was the determination to finish the process, even after the attack.
That's a key point. The Senate reconvened hours later to complete the certification. Shapiro documents how the attack made a few Republicans drop their objections.
But not all of them.
Not at all. Many others proceeded with the formal challenges, demonstrating this adherence to political loyalty, even in the face of a violent assault on the institution itself.
And that led directly to the second impeachment for incitement of insurrection. The book recounts McConnell's very complex, almost contradictory response.
Shapiro details McConnell's public statement right after the attack. It was this dramatic declaration assigning Trump practical and moral responsibility for the events of that day.
Which suggested a real institutional reckoning was finally at hand.
But then you juxtapose that with his eventual vote on conviction in the Senate trial, which was an acquittal.
The ultimate paradox. Why condemn him so strongly and then vote to acquit?
Shapiro frames it as a procedural escape hatch. McConnell argued the Senate lacked constitutional jurisdiction to try a president who had already left office.
A very convenient distinction.
Extremely. It allowed him to condemn Trump's actions politically while avoiding the institutional pain of fracturing his party. For the author, this was the ultimate failure of the Senate's checking function.
The book then moves into the beginning of the Biden administration, tracking how a 50-50 Senate handled its early agenda.
Right, and it shows that the habits of hyperpartisanship didn't just vanish with Trump. The procedural power structures that McConnell built are still fully in place.
And the infrastructure package is used as a key example.
Exactly. It shows how McConnell and other Republicans chose when to cooperate, often on things that benefited their constituents, and when to just revert to obstruction. Procedural power continues to shape every outcome.
So the book closes by framing the question that runs through the entire narrative. Can a highly polarized Senate still fulfill its basic role as a guardian against executive unuse?
Or has its institutional DNA just been permanently altered? Shapiro leaves that question open, but the outlook he presents is pretty grim. He suggests the patterns of procedural weaponization are now deeply entrenched.
So, to synthesize this overview, Shapiro's narrative is linear, it's character-driven, and it focuses intensely on the procedural actions of key figures like McConnell.
And the themes all center on institutional responsibility, hyperpartisanship, and the collapse of constitutional checks and balances. Public reception shows it's seen as an absorbing and deeply critical account of this era.
Beyond the politics described in the Betrayal, we want to leave you with one final thought.
What are the lasting structural implications of weaponizing Senate rules and norms, like the filibuster or the blue slip tradition, on the long-term stability of the institution itself, regardless of who is in power?
That really is the ultimate question. Click the link on screen for the in-depth book critique. Subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.